The 2JZ, an engine that was overbuilt for its time and even 30 years later is still used as a measuring stick for how easy power can be created. There's been stock rotating assemblies pushing north of 1,000 wheel horsepower through only 3 liters of displacement, which is ridiculously impressive, and the whole racing events have been created centered around this engine alone. Now, before we break down the 2JZ and urban legends around its creation, we have to dive into how this engine even started. In 1986, Toyota's newest generation of inline-6 engines known as the 7M GE and the 7M GTE were the crescendo of the M family of engines. You could find these engines in Mark III Supras and second-generation Toyota Soras and the Chaser and Crown in Japan. The 7M is a 3-liter inline-6 with an 83mm bore and a 91mm stroke, which is what we will call undersquare, or it has a longer stroke than the bore, which is beneficial for lower RPM torque production but limited by higher piston speed of the configuration. The GE was a dual overhead cam and an electronic fuel injection, while the GTE was a dual overhead cam turbocharged electronic fuel injection. And this naming system would carry over to the later 2JZ. The 7M GTE could produce 232 horsepower on 5 psi boost pressure, which was like blowing through a straw, which meant with simple modifications like a boost controller, larger injectors, and fooling the ECU to not fuel cut, you can easily add 100 horsepower over the stock specs. The iron engine block and forged crankshaft gave the 7M a decently robust bottom end that could hold 500 horsepower fairly reliably as long as you address those head bolts. Now in 1989, the 1JZ, which is the first engine in the JZ family, released in Japan for the 1990 Super 2.5 Twin Turbo R. This was all new architecture and improved heavily on the outgoing 7M. Yamaha developed the cylinder head, which on a flow bench outflows the 7M head by a noticeable margin. The iron engine blocks are completely different castings, with the 1JZ being much more robust with lots of block reinforcement. The bore is larger at 86mm, but shorter stroke of 71.5, making it over square, which allows larger valves than the 7M, but sacrificing some low-end torque that the 7M had. Even though the 7M was larger in displacement, the 2.5-liter 1JZ created more power since it used twin CT12A turbos ran in parallel at 8 psi versus the 7M's single CT26 on 5 psi. By 1991, however, Toyota needed a larger version of the 1JZ to power its more luxurious saloons like the anticipated Aristo and the next generation of the Toyota Supra. So Toyota further improved on the 1JZ to get what we know as the 2JZ. This wasn't a Yamaha collaboration like the 1JZ, but rather Toyota's improvement on the already great design of the 1J. The 2JZ differs a good bit from the 1JZ, first by having a taller deck height, approximately 24mm taller than the 1JZ. Next, this is probably going to be very contrary to popular belief, but the 2JZ head outflows the 1JZ head by a nice margin of CFM. Back in the day, it was rumored that putting the 1JZ GTE cylinder head on the 2JZ block is a way to make more power on a budget. While partially true because the chamber volume on the 1JZ is smaller and it bumps compression, it still gets outflowed by the 2JZ GTE head, which has been tested countless times to flow better. Next, the 2JZ is a square engine, meaning that the bore and stroke are the exact same, 86mm. The 2JZ also has a more aggressive camshaft duration and lift, mostly because it's a 3-liter engine versus a 2.5-liter engine and needs more cam duration to get the air in to feed the extra 500 cc's of displacement. One of the most important differences in the 2JZ GTE and the 1JZ GTE is the turbocharger design. The 2JZ GTE uses a sequential twin turbo system, which in lower RPMs has all the exhaust gases routed to one of the turbochargers. This is to spool it quickly. Then as RPM increases, the second turbo is pre-staged and then a valve opens to allow the second turbocharger to provide boost. It was a very revolutionary technology for 1991, especially when compared to the simple twin turbo system on the 1JZ. Now, the factory output of this engine isn't what put the 2JZ in legendary iconic status. It's what you can do with some overnight parts from Japan. When it comes to building a 2JZ, there's a lot of options and advantages, especially compared with some more modern engines out there. First, the 2JZ engine block found in the turbo and non-turbo models are identical closed deck iron blocks outside of the piston oil squirters, which are debatable with their usefulness. This means the cheaper GE blocks are just as good as a base to build as the turbo blocks. Next, in the earlier non-VVTi engines, the crankshaft and the rods are identical, with the turbo engines only difference being the GTE pistons are dished more for lower compression. This means that if you want a budget 2JZ bottom end and it's good for 700 horsepower, the non-VVTi earlier GE short blocks are pretty stout. The common notion of GE engines being a ticking time bomb under boost has to deal with the 1998 and up VVTi blocks that have a weaker connecting rod design, and VVTi can make lower RPM torque, which exacerbates this issue. Now, VVTi GTE assemblies are still very stout and arguably one of the best, since variable valve timing is a great tuning addition for street-driven cars that want to light the turbo off quicker by inducing overlap in the valves. Now, the cylinder heads on the GE and GTE have different port designs, which means that you can't interchange GE and GTE exhaust manifolds. Overwhelming majority of high horsepower 2JZs will be big single turbo conversions. For the fact that the factory twins are restrictive and complicated, turbo technology has gotten really good in the last 10 years, so the days of very laggy single turbos are pretty much gone. And most importantly, it's cheaper than building the twins or buying aftermarket twins. A key to the 2JZ's remarkable strength is its balance. All inline-six engines, for the most part, naturally are very balanced, since they are just essentially two inline threes mirroring each other from end to end. The buttery smooth operation means at higher stress levels, you don't have primary and secondary forces trying to rip the crankshaft out of the block. BMW still uses inline sixes in their performance cars because of how naturally balanced the inline six configuration is. Last but not least, reliability. Now, Toyota dominates this category of reliability, especially the 90s engines, and the 2JZ is no different. Even during its time, it was kind of advanced, but by modern standards, these engines are still very simplistic. Even the variable valve time system is the most rudimentary form of variable valve timing. The 2JZ, where it's going to suffer in the sense of reliability, or it's going to be previous owners that have abused these engines and they heard about 2JZs make 1,000 horsepower stock, so they push these engines without the mechanical know-how, and they sometimes abuse these engines. Also, these are aged engines. These engines are 30 years old sometimes, so you have to redo all the gaskets, the timing belt, valve stem seals. I mean, there's going to be a lot of things to get a junkyard 2JZ or a very heavily used 2JZ back up to its former glory. So it doesn't take away from its reliability at all. It's just you have to pick the right one. And the 2JZ arguably is one of the most reliable, high horsepower capable engines on the planet. So it's just, at the end of the day, you take care of it, it'll take care of you, and you'll be able to gap anything on the streets as long as you got some overnight parts from Japan.